Judge Theodore Washington sat in his federal courthouse chambers at 4:17 p.m., reviewing what should have been a routine afternoon. 23 years on the bench had taught him that justice often moved slowly, methodically, like a glacier carving its path through stone. But today felt different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His secretary knocked and entered without waiting, her face pale. Judge Washington, Chief Judge Martinez collapsed during lunch, heart attack. She placed a thick manila folder on his desk before he could respond. He's stable, but you need to take over the Sullivan-Parker case. The trial starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Theo opened the file, scanning the defendants' names with practiced efficiency. Officers Jake Sullivan and Marcus Parker, charged with excessive force, civil rights violations, and conspiracy under color of law. The case involved a pattern of racist arrests, planted evidence, and coordinated cover-ups spanning 3 years. He flipped through the evidence, his jaw tightening with each page. Body camera footage transcripts showed Sullivan screaming racial slurs while Parker held down a handcuffed teenager. Their victims were always black, always alone, always dismissed by their department as unreliable witnesses or criminals who deserved what they got. The Justice Department's been watching this precinct for months, his secretary continued, hovering near his desk. This case could trigger federal oversight of their entire department. Theo studied surveillance photos of the two officers. Sullivan's buzz cut, an aggressive stance in every image, shoulders squared like a man spoiling for a fight. Parker's smirking face during booking photos of their victims, casual cruelty worn like a badge of honor. Neither man showed any remorse in their depositions. They'd claimed every arrest was justified, every use of force necessary, every complaint unfounded. The evidence was damning. 17 citizen complaints in 3 years, 14 involving racial bias, all dismissed without investigation. A pattern so clear it practically screamed from the pages. At 6:30 p.m., his phone rang. "Sarah." His daughter's voice came through broken and scared. "Dad, I've been in an accident on I-95. I'm okay, but I need you. Mom's out of town and I'm alone at the hospital, and I'm really shaken up." Theo looked at the case files scattered across his desk, then at the photo of Sarah on his bookshelf. Her graduation photo, cap askew, smile bright with possibility. The decision was instant, inevitable. "I'm coming, sweetheart. Stay put. I'll be there as fast as I can." He could read the files in the car, prepare during the 5-hour drive. Justice would have to wait for a father's love. By 8 p.m., Theo was on the highway, his sedan eating up miles of darkened interstate. The case files sat in his passenger seat, Sullivan and Parker's faces visible in the dim glow of passing streetlights. He called Sarah every hour to check on her condition, relief flooding through him each time she answered. The radio played softly, NPR discussing police accountability protests, reform movements gaining momentum, communities demanding change. Theo adjusted his tie at a red light, thinking about tomorrow's trial, about the victims who'd waited years for justice, about the system that had protected Sullivan and Parker for so long. He didn't know that 200 miles away, at the same rest stop where he would soon arrive, Dale Morrison was already 3 beers deep and waiting. Didn't know that his expensive suit and dignified bearing would mark him as a target. Didn't know that the case files on his passenger seat would become evidence of an irony so profound that it would change everything. The stage was set for a collision that would expose not just individual racism, but an entire system's willingness to protect its own until that protection became impossible. At 8 p.m., Dale Morrison crushed another beer can and tossed it into the growing pile on his truck's floor. His buddy Travis sat beside him, equally drunk, both men marinating in their grievances like meat left too long in bad brine. "It's these liberal judges," Morrison slurred, pointing at a black family walking toward the rest stop bathrooms, letting criminals run wild while decent folks get hassled. He watched the family with narrowed eyes, beer breath hot in the truck's cabin. "Look at them acting like they own the place. In my daddy's day, they knew to stay in their section." Travis nodded, his own legal troubles making him bitter. "My court date's next month. Some bleeding heart judge is probably going to give me community service instead of throwing the book at the wife I caught cheating." He took another swig. "The system's rigged against working men." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "These judges don't know real people. They sit in their ivory towers making decisions about folks they never met." He gestured vaguely at the parking lot. "Someone should teach them a lesson about how the real world works." They spent the next hour pointing at every black traveler who passed, making comments they thought were clever. Each beer made them bolder, their racism flowing free without the thin veneer of civility society usually demanded. 30 miles away, at the police station, Officers Sullivan and Parker were ending their shift with the same sense of aggrieved victimhood. Travis stepped on the wallet, grinding it under his boot, obscuring the judicial seal pressed into the leather. "Probably fake ID anyway. They all got fake papers these days." Morrison continued his performance for the 911 operator, his voice rising with manufactured panic. "Yeah, he's acting real suspicious, looking in car windows, trying to run when I confronted him. Definitely up to no good. Better send multiple units. This one looks dangerous." Theo bent to retrieve his ID, but Morrison kicked it further away. "Don't move, I said. Don't move," he shouted into the phone. "He's not complying with citizen's arrest. This is exactly the kind of criminal behavior we're dealing with." "I'm not under citizen's arrest," Theo said firmly, forcing himself to maintain composure. "You have no legal authority." "Listen to him," Morrison interrupted, talking into the phone, talking like he knows the law. "Probably been through the system before. Send those cops fast." Within 8 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, lights flashing blue and red across the parking lot like a carnival from hell. Officers Jake Sullivan and Marcus Parker stepped out, hands already moving toward their weapons as they assessed the scene. A well-dressed black man facing off against 2 white men. Sullivan took charge immediately, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "What's the situation here?" Morrison rushed forward, playing the victim perfectly. "Thank God you're here, officers. This man's been acting suspicious, looking in car windows, probably planning thefts. When I tried to be a good citizen and keep an eye on him, he got aggressive and threatening." Parker nodded, never taking his eyes off Theo. "Sir, place your hands on your head and interlace your fingers." "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I stopped here to use the restroom. I have identification." "I said, hands on your head," Parker barked. "Stop reaching." Theo complied, watching his constitutional rights evaporate in real time. "I wasn't reaching for anything. My ID is on the ground over there." Sullivan examined the scattered wallet with his flashlight, but the judicial seal was face down, obscured by dirt and Travis's boot print. He saw only expensive leather and credit cards. "Pretty fancy wallet for someone who looks like you. Where'd you steal it?" "I didn't steal anything. I'm a federal employee." "Federal employee, right. What are you, a postal worker, janitor at some government building?" Morrison chimed in again, his confidence growing with police presence. "Officers, I told you he was trouble. Probably got warrants, probably selling drugs. You should search that car thoroughly." Parker tightened the handcuffs deliberately, making them bite deeper into Theo's wrists. "You're being detained pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." As they loaded him into the patrol car, Theo heard Morrison's final insult, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences in his life. "That's what happens when you forget your place, boy. This is still America." Sullivan slammed the car door, then turned to Parker with satisfaction. "Easy arrest. These types always think they're smarter than they are." Neither officer bothered to properly examine Theo's identification. Neither checked the case files visible in his car. Neither wondered why a supposed criminal spoke with such precise legal terminology and maintained such dignity under pressure. Parker started the engine, completely unaware that he was transporting tomorrow morning's judge to jail. In the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, Judge Theodore Washington stared out the window at the passing streetlights. He thought about his daughter waiting at the hospital, about the case files he'd been studying, about the irony of the moment. Most of all, he thought about justice, how it could be delayed, distorted, and denied, but never truly destroyed. Because tomorrow morning, in exactly 9 hours and 13 minutes, Officers Sullivan and Parker were going to learn that justice has a way of finding those who think they're above it.
"Another activist judge," Sullivan said, adjusting his bulletproof vest in front of his locker. "Probably gonna lecture us about sensitivity while criminals laugh at us." Parker's phone buzzed with an email marked "Urgent Case Update," but he was too busy complaining to read it thoroughly. "I heard this new judge is tough. Someone said he's been on the bench forever." He scrolled past the email without opening it. Probably another old white guy who thinks he understands the streets because he read some sociology textbook. They spent 20 minutes in the locker room, mocking their previous arrests. Sullivan did an exaggerated impression of a suspect's voice, high-pitched and servile. Parker laughed, adding his own embellishments, joking about accidental injuries during bookings. Their body cameras were off, but the station's internal recording system captured every word, every laugh, every casual admission of brutality. "You know what pisses me off most?" Sullivan continued, slamming his locker shut. "These people act like we're the criminals. We're protecting society from animals, and they want to put us in prison for it." Parker nodded, his smirk firmly in place. "Tomorrow's gonna be a long day. Hope this judge doesn't buy into the racial victimhood narrative. Hope he understands what it's like out here." Neither officer bothered reading their emails. Neither checked the case update that would have told them Chief Judge Martinez had suffered a heart attack. Neither learned that a new judge had taken over their case. Neither realized that fate was about to deliver the ultimate test of their beliefs about justice, respect, and the consequences of unchecked power. At 11:35 p.m., Judge Theodore Washington's sedan pulled into the Rest Haven truck stop parking lot. He stepped out, straightening his tie, unaware that Morrison had been watching and waiting. The case files remained visible on his passenger seat, Sullivan and Parker's faces staring up through the window. Evidence of the irony about to unfold. Morrison nudged Travis, gesturing toward Theo. "Well, well, look at this one. Fancy car, fancy suit. Let's see if he knows his place." The stage was set. 2 drunk racists, 2 corrupt cops heading home to rest before their trial, and 1 federal judge who didn't know he was about to experience firsthand the nightmare he'd been studying all evening. The collision was inevitable now. The only question was how devastating it would be. At 11:47 p.m., Judge Theodore Washington stepped into the fluorescent-lit nightmare that would change everything. Morrison was waiting, swaying slightly as he blocked Theo's path to the restroom. "Well, well, look what we got here." He circled Theo like a shark sensing blood. "Fancy car, fancy suit. You think you're better than us working folks?" Theo tried to step around him, already calculating the situation. drunk, aggressive, potentially dangerous. "Excuse me? I just need to—" "I'm talking to you, boy." Morrison shoved Theo hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. "Don't you walk away when a white man's speaking to you." Travis emerged from the truck, beer in hand, grinning at the confrontation. "Dale's right. You got some nerve rolling up here like you own the place." Morrison grabbed Theo's jacket lapel, his face inches away, breath reeking of cheap beer and cheaper hate. "I bet this car is stolen. I bet you got drugs in there. I bet you're running from something." He twisted the expensive fabric in his fists. "What's a criminal like you doing in a suit? Playing dress-up?" Theo kept his voice calm, professional, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Sir, I'm just traveling through. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You are the trouble, bringing your kind around decent people." He spit directly at Theo's feet. "Get on your knees and empty your pockets. Let's see what you stole." "I'm not going to do that." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morrison's expression turned vicious. "Oh, you're one of those uppity ones. Think you're equal to us?" He pulled out his phone. "Well, let's see what the police think about your attitude." Theo watched Morrison dial 911, knowing exactly what was about to happen. 23 years of studying civil rights cases had taught him the script by heart. He'd read transcripts of these calls hundreds of times. Now, he was living one. 911, what's your emergency?" Morrison put on his most concerned citizen voice, the transformation grotesque in its smoothness. "Yeah, I'm at the Rest Haven truck stop on I-77. There's a suspicious black male here acting aggressive, probably casing vehicles for theft. He's got a fancy car that doesn't match his demographic, if you know what I mean. I think he might be armed." Theo pulled out his wallet, hoping to defuse the situation before it spiraled further. "Sir, here's my identification. I'm a federal—" He slapped the wallet from Theo's hands, sending it skidding across the asphalt face down. "Keep your hands where I can see him," he shouted into the phone. "He's reaching for something. Send units now."
The patrol car disappeared into the night, carrying its precious cargo toward the most spectacular reversal of fortune in legal history. The patrol car's radio chatter filled the silence as Sullivan and Parker transported their prisoner toward downtown booking. In the back seat, Judge Theodore Washington sat with perfect posture despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. "Tomorrow's gonna be rough," Sullivan said, adjusting his rearview mirror to keep an eye on Theo. "New judge taking over our case at the last minute." Parker groaned from the passenger seat. "Great, just what we need. Starting over with some bleeding heart liberal who's gonna buy into every sob story." He shifted to look back at Theo. At least Judge Martinez knew how things really work on the street. Sullivan nodded. This new guy's probably fresh out of law school, thinks he can change the world. Theo listened to them complaining about the new judge while transporting that very judge in handcuffs. The irony was so profound it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. "You think he'll dismiss the charges?" Parker asked. "Nah, but he'll probably lecture us about police brutality and community relations. These academic types love their speeches." At 12:47 a.m., they arrived at the county jail. The booking sergeant, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced up from her paperwork. "What we got?" she asked routinely. "Suspicious person, possible vehicle theft, interfering with investigation. Classic troublemaker who thinks he knows the law." The sergeant typed the charges into her computer while Sullivan uncuffed Theo's hands. "Empty your pockets on the counter. Everything." Theo complied silently, placing his wallet, keys, cell phone, and a small leather notebook on the stainless steel surface. The sergeant inventoried each item without interest, still missing the judicial identification card that remained face down in the wallet. "Expensive stuff for someone in your situation," she commented, examining Theo's Rolex. "Hope you got receipts."
"The watch was a gift from my colleagues," Theo said quietly. "Colleagues? What colleagues? Your fellow inmates?" The booking process continued with methodical humiliation. Fingerprints pressed into ink pads, mugshots taken from multiple angles, the camera flash capturing Theo's composed expression. Personal questions delivered with barely concealed contempt. "Occupation?" the surgeon asked. "Federal employee," Theo answered. "Be specific. Janitor, maintenance, security guard." Theo hesitated, knowing the truth would sound like a lie. "Judicial services." Sullivan snorted. "Right, and I'm the Attorney General." "Phone call," the sergeant announced, sliding an ancient payphone across the counter. Theo dialed his daughter's number. No answer. She was probably sedated at the hospital. He tried his law clerk's emergency line. Voicemail. Finally, he called his attorney. "Michael, it's Theo. I've been arrested on false charges. I'm being held at county booking. Can you—" The line went dead. 30 seconds maximum per call. "Time's up, hotshot. Nobody's coming to bail you out. Guess your colleagues aren't as loyal as you thought." They led him to holding cell 3, containing 6 other men. All black, all arrested on similarly vague charges. The cell reeked of disinfectant and desperation. "What you in for, brother?" asked a young man who couldn't have been more than 19. "False accusations," Theo replied, settling onto the metal bench. "Ain't we all?" the teenager laughed bitterly. "They got me for loitering with intent. Intent to do what? Stand outside my own apartment building?" An older man in the corner looked up. "They got me for interfering with police business. My business was asking why they arrested my nephew." For the next hour, Theo listened to story after story. Each man a victim of the same systemic harassment he'd been studying in case files. But now he wasn't reading about it in legal briefs. He was living it. The teenager, Marcus Williams, was facing his 3rd arrest in 6 months, all on charges that would later be dismissed for lack of evidence. The older man, Robert Johnson, was a church deacon whose interference consisted in asking for badge numbers. "You talk different than most folks they bring in here," Marcus observed. "Are you some kind of lawyer or something?" Theo considered his answer carefully. "I work in the legal system." "Then you know this is all bullshit," Robert said. "They arrest us to fill quotas, make us sit here for hours, then let us go with court dates we can't afford to miss work for. The process is the punishment." "The process is the punishment," Theo agreed, recognizing the systematic nature of what he was witnessing. Marcus leaned forward. "You really know about law stuff? Because they're trying to say I was selling drugs, but they never found any drugs." For the next 2 hours, Theo found himself providing legal advice to his fellow inmates, explaining search and seizure laws, discussing probable cause, outlining their rights. It felt natural, purposeful, even here. Justice needed advocates everywhere. At 3:17 a.m., Theo checked the wall clock. In less than 6 hours, he needed to be in federal court, presiding over the case that would now take on new dimensions of meaning. Justice, he reflected, worked in mysterious ways. At 6:15 a.m., Sergeant Patricia Williams arrived for her morning shift, carrying coffee and the weight of 25 years in law enforcement. She'd seen everything, so she thought, until she reviewed the overnight arrest log.
"Washington Theodore J.," she read aloud, scanning the booking sheet. The name triggered something in her memory, a nagging familiarity that made her pause mid-sip of coffee. She pulled up the county court system on her computer, cross-referencing the name with active cases. Nothing. Then she tried the federal database, typing Washington Theodore J. into the judicial directory. The screen loaded slowly, then displayed a professional headshot that made Sergeant Williams's blood run cold. Distinguished black man, salt and pepper beard, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The same face from last night's booking photos. The Honorable Theodore J. Washington, United States District Judge, Eastern District. Holy Mother of God!
Williams whispered, her hands shaking as she scrolled through Judge Washington's biography. 23 years on the federal bench, appointed by President Clinton, confirmed unanimously by the Senate, currently presiding over high-profile civil rights cases. She clicked on the court calendar, desperate to prove her growing suspicion wrong. But there it was, scheduled for 9 a.m., United States v. Sullivan and Parker, excessive force and civil rights violations. Presiding judge, Honorable Theodore J. Washington. The same Sullivan and Parker who had arrested him 6 hours ago? Williams's phone call to Captain Morrison woke him from deep sleep. "Sir, we have a catastrophic problem. Officer Sullivan and Parker arrested their own judge last night." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Williams wondered if the line had gone dead. "Repeat that," Captain Morrison finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sullivan and Parker arrested Judge Theodore Washington at 11:47 p.m. He's been in holding all night. He's supposed to be on the bench in 3 hours for their trial." Jesus Christ. Papers rustled as the captain searched for the case file. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I'm looking at his federal ID right now. Judge Washington, Eastern District Federal Court, the man who's going to decide whether Sullivan and Parker go to prison." 20 minutes later, Captain Morrison burst through the station doors, followed by Internal Affairs Lieutenant Sarah Collins and Deputy Chief Robert Hayes. The entire command structure had mobilized for damage control. "Where is he?" Captain Morrison demanded. "Still in holding cell 3, Williams reported. "I haven't told him we know who he is." Lieutenant Collins pulled up the arrest report on her tablet. "Christ, look at these charges. Suspicious person, possible vehicle theft, based on what evidence?" "A drunk racist's 911 call and our officer's assumption that a black man in an expensive car must be a criminal," Deputy Chief Hayes said grimly. "This is going to destroy us." They reviewed the body camera footage in horrified silence. Sullivan's racist tirade, Sullivan and Parker's immediate assumption of guilt, the casual violence, the deliberate humiliation, the complete disregard for basic civil rights. "They never even looked at his ID properly," Collins observed. "It was right there on the ground." "Because they didn't want to look," Hayes replied. "They saw what they expected to see." Captain Morrison was already calculating the damage. Federal oversight, Justice Department investigation, civil rights lawsuit, congressional hearings. This goes all the way to the top. In holding cell 3, Judge Washington was helping Marcus understand the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause when the cell door suddenly opened. Sergeant Williams stood there with 3 senior officers, all looking like they'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Washington," Williams said carefully, "would you please come with us?" The other inmates watched nervously as Theo stood. "Am I being released?" "There's been a development in your case." They led Judge Washington to an interview room where Captain Morrison sat alone, sweating despite the morning chill. His hands shook as he reviewed Theo's file. "Judge Washington," he began, then stopped, unable to meet Theo's eyes. "Your Honor, we had no idea." Theo sat down slowly, maintaining his composure. "You had no idea about what, Captain?" "About who you are, about your position." Morrison's voice cracked. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has there?" Theo's voice remained perfectly calm. "Because from my perspective, your officers followed standard procedure. They responded to a call, made assumptions based on my appearance, and arrested me without probable cause." Morrison winced at each word. "The charges are being dropped immediately. All records expunged. You're free to go." "That's very kind of you," Theo said, "but I'm curious. If I actually was the car thief your officers believed me to be, would those charges still be dropped? Would those records still be expunged?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Morrison had no answer. "Your Honor, please understand—" "I understand perfectly," Theo interrupted. "I understand that I'm being released not because the arrest was wrong, but because you've discovered it was inconvenient." Morrison tried desperately to salvage the situation. "We're prepared to offer a full apology, complete cooperation with any investigation, disciplinary action for the officers involved." Theo stood, straightening his rumpled suit. "Captain, in approximately 2.5 hours, I'll be sitting on the federal bench presiding over a case involving Officers Sullivan and Parker, a case about their pattern of racially motivated arrests and excessive force." The blood drained from Morrison's face. "Your Honor, surely you'll recuse yourself, given the conflict of interest." Theo smiled for the first time since his arrest. "Conflict of interest, Captain? I'd say I now have a very clear understanding of how your officers operate. Perhaps clearer than any judge has ever had." Morrison stood up desperately. "Judge Washington, please. These men have families, careers. This was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Theo's voice cut like ice. "Captain, your officers spent 6 hours believing I was a criminal based solely on my race. They humiliated me, violated my rights, and celebrated doing it. The only misunderstanding was thinking they could continue this behavior without consequences." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Captain, you might want to review your officers' training records. In 2 hours and 43 minutes, every word of last night's encounter will be entered into federal evidence. Every racist comment, every violation of procedure, every moment of casual cruelty." Morrison slumped back in his chair as Theo left the room. Through the window, he could see Sullivan and Parker arriving for their shift, laughing about something, completely unaware that their careers, and possibly their freedom, had ended at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. Lieutenant Collins knocked and entered. "Sir, what do we do?" Morrison stared at the empty doorway where Judge Washington had been. "Pray," he said quietly. "Pray that the federal prison has room for 2 more dirty cops." In the parking lot, Theo retrieved his case files from his sedan and checked his watch. 7:23 a.m. Enough time to go home, shower, put on fresh robes, and return for the most important trial of his career. A trial where he would no longer need to imagine what his defendant's victims had experienced. He had lived it. At 8:45 a.m., Judge Theodore Washington emerged from his chambers wearing fresh robes, the handcuff marks on his wrists fading but still visible. The federal courthouse buzzed with unusual energy. Word had somehow leaked that something extraordinary was about to happen. At 8:52 a.m., Officers Sullivan and Parker walked through the courthouse security checkpoint, their polished badges catching the morning light. They carried themselves with casual arrogance, joking with court security about another day of liberal lecture therapy. "Think this new judge will be reasonable?" Parker asked, adjusting his dress uniform. "They're all the same," Sullivan replied. "Academic types who've never walked a beat, never faced real criminals. He'll probably want to discuss our cultural sensitivity and community relations." They settled into the defendant's table, where their attorney, Public Defender Michael Harrison, was spreading case files with trembling hands. Harrison looked pale and sweaty, constantly checking his watch and scanning the courtroom entrance. "Something wrong, counselor?" Sullivan asked. Harrison wiped sweat from his forehead. "I received some unusual communications this morning. Federal oversight, investigators, internal affairs, even the Justice Department. Everyone wants to be present for this hearing." Parker shrugged. "Good. Let them see how we really handle crime in this city." The gallery was packed with an unusual crowd.
federal investigators with serious expressions, civil rights attorneys with briefcases, reporters scribbling notes. Something was different today. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom like a bell-tolling judgment. All rise. The Honorable Theodore Washington presiding. The courtroom door opened. Sullivan and Parker looked up to see their judge for the first time. Both men froze. Parker's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table. Sullivan's mouth fell open, color draining from his face like water from a broken dam. "Oh my God," Parker whispered, his voice barely audible. Sullivan gripped the table edge so hard his knuckles went white. That's the man you arrested last night," Harrison finished, having pieced together the morning's frantic phone calls. "Judge Theodore Washington, Eastern District Federal Court." The courtroom exploded in gasps and whispered conversations. Harrison buried his face in his hands while his client stared in disbelief. Theo took his seat on the bench, his movements deliberate and controlled. He surveyed the courtroom, the packed gallery of investigators, the civil rights attorneys leaning forward, the reporters whose sources had tipped them off to history in the making. "Good morning," Theo said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. "Before we proceed with today's hearing, the court must address a significant development that occurred last evening." Sullivan and Parker sat paralyzed, their faces masks of horror. "At approximately 11:47 p.m. yesterday evening, I was unlawfully detained, arrested, and imprisoned by the defendants in this case, Officers Sullivan and Parker, based on false accusations and racial profiling." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Federal investigators exchanged knowing looks. Harrison's head remained in his hands while his client stared in disbelief. Theo continued with judicial calm. "This incident has created what might appear to be a conflict of interest. However, after careful consideration and consultation with judicial ethics guidelines, I have determined that this experience provides me with invaluable first-hand knowledge of the defendant's character and methods." Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the government requests that last night's incident be entered as additional evidence of the defendant's pattern of discriminatory enforcement." "So ordered," Theo replied without hesitation. "Bailiff, please activate the courtroom recording system." The revelation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted, and justice, delayed by 6 hours in a county jail cell, was about to be delivered with the full force of federal law.
For the next 3 hours, the courtroom became a theater of reckoning. Judge Washington's voice filled the space with judicial authority as body camera footage played on monitors throughout the gallery. The videos showed Sullivan and Parker's previous arrests, identical tactics used on other black citizens, the same racial profiling, the same false accusations, the same coordinated lies. But now the patterns weren't abstract case files, they were lived experiences the judge could speak to directly. "Mr. Sullivan," Theo said, addressing the officer with surgical precision, "in your deposition, you stated that you always follow proper procedure when detaining suspects. Can you explain why proper procedure includes accepting the unsubstantiated word of an intoxicated racist over the calm denials of the accused?" Sullivan's attorney objected, but Theo overruled. "The defendant will answer." Sullivan stammered, his confidence shattered. "Your Honor, we had to respond to the citizen's complaint. The citizen who called me boy and demanded I get on my knees, that citizen?" The courtroom was dead silent.
Sullivan had no answer. Theo turned to Parker. "Officer Parker, you documented in your report that I made gang threats against the complainants. Can you specify what these alleged threats were?" Parker's face was ashen. The complainant reported, "Officer Parker, I was present during this entire encounter. I made no threats of any kind. Are you testifying under oath that you documented threats that never occurred?" Harrison finally found his voice. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of questioning. My clients—" "Your clients," Theo interrupted, "spent 6 hours believing they had arrested a car thief. They celebrated their easy arrest. They made racist jokes about my expensive wallet and fancy talk. They questioned my right to own a luxury vehicle based solely on my race." He paused, letting the words sink in. "All of this was recorded on station security cameras and their own body cameras. All of it demonstrates the exact pattern of behavior alleged in the original civil rights charges." At 10:30 a.m., FBI agents entered the courtroom with federal warrants. Special Agent Rebecca Foster approached the bench. "Your Honor, based on last night's incident and this morning's revelations, the Justice Department is initiating a comprehensive investigation of the entire police department under Section 14141 of the Civil Rights Act." Captain Morrison, sitting in the gallery, visibly slumped. Federal oversight meant the end of departmental autonomy, the end of protecting problematic officers, the end of business as usual. The afternoon session brought testimony from the victims. Marcus Williams took the stand, his youth making his story even more devastating. "They arrested me 3 times in 6 months, once for standing outside my own apartment, once for walking to the store, once for asking why they were in my neighborhood. Every charge was dismissed, but I still lost my job because I kept missing work for court dates." Robert Johnson followed. "I asked their badge numbers when they arrested my nephew. They said I was interfering with police business. They handcuffed me in front of my congregation." 15 more victims testified, each describing treatment identical to what Judge Washington had experienced. The pattern was undeniable. By 3 p.m., Internal Affairs Lieutenant Sarah Collins was detailing the department's history of covering up complaints against both officers. 17 citizen complaints in 3 years, 14 involving racial bias, all dismissed without investigation. "Lieutenant Collins," Theo asked, "in your professional opinion, does last night's incident represent an anomaly in the defendant's behavior?" "No, Your Honor. It represents the natural culmination of a pattern we've been ignoring for years." Sullivan began crying silently. Parker stared at his hands. Their badges had been their shields, and now those shields were gone. The Justice Department announced federal charges beyond the original civil rights violations: conspiracy under color of law, deprivation of rights, obstruction of justice, and filing false police reports. Harrison requested a recess to discuss plea negotiations. Prosecutor Martinez's response was swift and public. "Mr. Harrison, your clients arrested a federal judge based on racial prejudice and then spent hours celebrating their accomplishment. There will be no plea negotiations." As the session concluded, Theo addressed the defendants directly. "Officers Sullivan and Parker, you have spent your careers believing that badges make you untouchable, that victims of your bias have no voice, no power, no recourse. Last night, you learned differently." Both men looked up at him with desperate eyes. "But this case was never about me," Theo continued. "It was about every Marcus Williams, every Robert Johnson, every citizen you've targeted because of their race. I was simply privileged enough to experience what they experience regularly, and powerful enough to ensure consequences follow." Sullivan finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor, we didn't know."
Theo's response was swift and sharp. "Officer Sullivan, you didn't know because you didn't want to know. You saw a black man and assumed criminality. You heard racist accusations and assumed validity. You witnessed dignity under pressure and assumed guilt."
He leaned forward slightly. "The fact that I happen to be a federal judge doesn't make your actions worse. It simply makes the consequences unavoidable." 3 months later, the same federal courthouse served as the stage for Justice's final act. The media circus outside rivaled a presidential visit. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local stations from 6 states broadcasting live as the nation watched 2 corrupt officers face consequences for their racism. Inside courtroom 4A, Judge Washington presided with the same measured dignity he'd maintained through months of testimony, federal investigations, and death threats from white supremacist groups who viewed him as a symbol of their worst fears. Officers Sullivan and Parker sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, their transformation from swaggering cops to broken convicts complete. Sullivan had aged a decade in 3 months. Parker stared at his shackled hands, occasionally glancing at the packed gallery where his wife sat crying. "The defendants will rise," Judge Washington commanded. Both men stood unsteadily, their public defender flanking them like a priest administering last rites. Theo reviewed the sentencing guidelines, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "Officers Sullivan and Parker, a federal jury has found you guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, deprivation of constitutional rights, obstruction of justice, and filing false police reports." The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. The evidence presented during this trial revealed not an isolated incident, but a systematic campaign of racial terrorism conducted under the protection of police badges. 17 documented victims, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees for innocent citizens, immeasurable damage to community trust in law enforcement. Sullivan's legs buckled slightly. Parker's wife sobbed audibly. "Your actions on the night of my arrest were not aberrant. They were typical. You saw a black citizen exercising his constitutional right to travel freely, and you decided he needed to be controlled, humiliated, and caged." Theo's voice grew stronger, carrying decades of judicial experience and the personal weight of having endured their racism firsthand. "The court sentences Jake Sullivan to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Marcus Parker, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. Both defendants are permanently barred from law enforcement employment and will register as civil rights violators." The sentences exceeded expectations. Federal guidelines suggested 3 to 5 years, but Judge Washington's enhancement factors, targeting a federal official, pattern of abuse, obstruction of justice, justified the harsh punishment. Furthermore, Theo continued, the court orders restitution payments totaling $2.3 million to be distributed among your documented victims. Sullivan collapsed into his chair. His police pension, his house, his children's college funds, everything would go toward compensating the people he'd terrorized. Dale Morrison received his own judgment 2 hours later in state court. Federal hate crime charges carried a 3-year sentence, plus lifetime probation, requiring anger management counseling and community service specifically focused on racial reconciliation. The afternoon brought the announcement everyone had been waiting for, the federal consent decree. Deputy Chief Hayes, now serving as interim chief after Captain Morrison's resignation, signed the 247-page agreement that would govern police operations for the next 5 years. Federal monitors would oversee hiring, training, and disciplinary procedures. Body cameras would be mandatory and always activated. Racial bias training would be conducted quarterly. An independent civilian review board would handle complaint investigations. This consent decree represents the most comprehensive police reform in modern American history, announced Justice Department Civil Rights Division Chief Rebecca Martinez. Judge Washington's experience exposed systemic failures that demanded systematic solutions. The financial impact was staggering. The department's $50 million annual budget would increase by 30% to fund reforms. Federal oversight would cost an additional $15 million yearly. Insurance premiums skyrocketed as the city became a high-risk liability. But the human impact was more profound. Marcus Williams had been accepted to law school with a full scholarship funded by civil rights organizations. Robert Johnson was appointed to the new Civilian Review Board. 17 other victims received substantial settlements and public apologies. At 4:47 p.m., exactly 5 hours after the time of his arrest, 90 days earlier, Judge Washington concluded the most significant case of his career. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice served, even belatedly, creates ripples that transform entire communities. As he struck his gavel for the final time, federal marshals began the process of transporting Sullivan and Parker to different maximum security prisons, separated to prevent them from coordinating their stories or plotting revenge. Outside, protesters from both sides lined the courthouse steps. But inside the courthouse, justice wasn't about sides or politics. It was about two racist cops spending the next 6 to 7 years learning that badges don't make anyone untouchable, and that karma, when it finally arrives, collects with interest. 1 year after the sentencing, Judge Theodore Washington pulled his sedan into the same Rest Haven truck stop where his nightmare had begun. The fluorescent lights cast the same harsh glare, but everything else had changed. New management signs proclaimed, "All travelers welcome," in English and Spanish. Diversity training certificates hung prominently near the entrance. Security cameras covered every angle, all mandated after the federal civil rights lawsuit that had cost the previous owners $4.2 million.
Theo stepped out of his car, straightening the same tie he'd worn that terrible night. A young black family was using the picnic tables nearby, their children playing freely while their parents relaxed without fear. An elderly white couple nodded respectfully as they passed him, their simple courtesy a stark contrast to the hatred he'd experienced here. The gas station attendant, a college-aged Latina woman, smiled warmly. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" "Just stretching my legs, thank you." She paused, studying his face. "Excuse me, but are you Judge Washington, the one from the news?" Theo nodded, bracing for whatever reaction might follow. "My professor showed us your case in constitutional law class. What you did, it changed everything for people like my family." The statistics proved her right. Police complaints in their jurisdiction had dropped 67% since the consent decree took effect. Use of force incidents involving racial minorities had decreased by 78%. Community trust in law enforcement, measured by anonymous surveys, had risen from 23% to 61% among black residents. Marcus Williams had graduated from Howard University Law School with honors and been hired as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases. His first conviction, another police excessive force case, had been secured using precedents established in Judge Washington's courtroom. Robert Johnson now served on the Civilian Review Board, ensuring that complaints would never again be dismissed without investigation. Sullivan and Parker were serving their sentences in separate federal prisons. Prison records showed Sullivan had been hospitalized twice after confrontations with inmates who recognized him from news coverage. Parker had requested protective custody after receiving death threats. Dale Morrison had completed his first year of court-ordered community service, working at a homeless shelter in a predominantly black neighborhood. His mandatory racial sensitivity counseling had opened his eyes to the humanity he'd spent decades denying, though his transformation came too late to undo the damage he'd caused. As Theo prepared to leave the rest stop, his phone rang. Sarah, now a sophomore at Georgetown, was calling with news about her acceptance to a summer internship with the Civil Rights Division. "Dad, I want to do what you do, fight for justice." Theo smiled, looking around at the transformed truck stop one final time. "Justice isn't something you fight for, sweetheart. It's something you create, one case at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time." He drove home that evening thinking about the young law students who would carry these lessons forward. The police officers who would think twice before letting prejudice guide their actions. The citizens who now knew that even the most powerful systems could be held accountable. Justice had prevailed not through vengeance or anger, but through the simple insistence that all people, regardless of race, status, or position, deserved equal treatment under law. The system had tried to break Judge Theodore Washington at 11:47 p.m. on a dark highway rest stop. Instead, he had used that moment to rebuild it stronger, fairer, and more just. The final image, a rest stop that once symbolized humiliation, now represented possibility, proving that even the most entrenched systems can change when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as normal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.